Welcome back, and thank you for joining me for another exciting episode of Coaching in Higher Education. I'm your host, Tim Jansa, a certified leadership and organizational development coach and higher ed professional of almost 20 years. I'm joined today by Dr. Rubina Malik, who is a global learning and development expert and managing director at Malik Global Solutions. I invited her to join us to discuss a topic that unfortunately seems to be top of mind for many higher ed leaders and employees these days, namely career pathways, choices, and development. So, how can coaching help people with career growth and institutions to establish better defined advancement pathways across campus? To answer that question, let's jump right in and ask Dr. Malik. Welcome to the program, Rubina.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's such a pleasure to be here and see you. Thank you for inviting me.
So, Rubina, as you know, career pipelines are really baked into how most organizations in industry, nonprofit, and even government operate. But in higher ed, it's a little different story because, aside from tenure track for faculty, there's often really no clearly defined path for advancement or even kind of a talent pipeline at colleges and university, and especially then the staff leadership positions. So what's been your experience with career coaching in higher ed? And maybe you can even talk a little bit about some of those common barriers that staff face when it comes to career advancement that maybe we as coaches can help them overcome.
Yeah, and Tim, this is such a great conversation. And, I come here with talking about this conversation with two hats, right? So I've spent 20 years in academia. I know, like I'm 29 and a half. You thought I was 25, and how can I have 20 years? But, I have 20 years in academia. And not just that, I actually am a certified coach like yourself. So this experience actually gives me a unique perspective. I know the pressures, the challenges, and the different culture in higher ed. From the inside, and also understand how coaching can transform individuals and institutions. From the outside. So, for me, having had that experience and having a lived experience, career growth in higher education is not just about promotions, not just about getting tenure, not just about, oh, I'm going from assistant to associate or to, full professor. It's really about purpose. It's about skills, and it's about navigating choices that align with the individual as well as the organization. So I think sometimes like we miss that. Institutions miss that. Like they want to um, promote somebody maybe because they have seniority or maybe they have tenure versus are they really ready to run a department, do a budget, empower the people that are there, etc. And the funny part is sometimes I think that we okay, I worked in the business school, so here we are teaching about business, but we can't run our own department using what we know to make sure that we're running our department effectively. So when it comes to like career pathing, Tim, I see coaching as the bridge between where people are today and then the leaders that they can actually, become, as well as not just become, but create, right? Because at the end of the day, when we look at higher education right now, I mean, the trends are around, we can call it, it's the great higher education resignation. I mean, a lot of people are going to be resigning, baby boomers, they're getting of age. And the question is, do we have people to fill those positions? So are we creating those pathways? Are we creating sustainability succession planning, which I think is very important. So, higher education is not all about learning. Now it's also about unlearning those outdated structures and reimagining career pathways and creating pipelines for the future leadership, in higher education.
I love that you brought up purpose because I think that is one of the big changes that has happened in the wake of the pandemic. And of course, there's a newer generation, of course, of employees as well. But I think the pandemic was a big reckoning for a lot of employees who finally saw that, number one, working from home is actually possible and preferable and enjoyable. Um, so there are different working
Yeah,
modalities. But this whole idea about finding purpose in their job is something that I think our institutions, by and large, have not done a very good job providing. So I think as coaches, working with clients to help them kind of identify what their purpose is, what their values are. And you mentioned skills, which is also this whole question of transferable skills. When you're in higher ed, it's a lot about your position, your title, your rank, your job description, and that kind of defines you. But there are very few mechanisms in place that help you discover like what are your
yeah,
transferable skills? What else can you do? And I think coaching is so uniquely set up to actually help people discover what they may not
yeah,
know. Um, and unfortunately, this has now resulted in this whole, you call it the great resignation, and it's true. There are a lot of people leaving. The loyalty that a lot of folks in the past have felt toward their institutions is pretty much gone. But there's another aspect to it that I just read about, and that really made me think is that we're always talking about the future of work, but we haven't really reckoned with the past. What has happened in the wake of the pandemic? Why are we in this situation? Why are so many folks leaving higher ed? And I think that's so important to figure out so we can actually retain them. Um, so what I'm seeing is that it's not just staff members, but also a lot of faculty members who are trying to look for employment elsewhere, seeking some greener pastures. Uh, is that something you're observing as well? And what can a coach do to support those folks who might be looking elsewhere?
yeah, Tim, like really great observation and a great question. And yes, I mean, there's definitely trends. I'm definitely seeing a trend around, academics exploring careers in the industry, nonprofits, and like even as an entrepreneur, hello, like I'm included in that, right? And oftentimes, what I'm finding is that, they're burnt out, they have limited advancement opportunities. And, sometimes it's political in the office. And so they don't might not have those opportunities. And I'm just going to call a spade, right? And then sometimes there's funding pressures, and sometimes there's that desire to have flexibility, which they may not have. Although I like to think, for me, I did have that flexibility, but some don't, especially if they're going towards that tenure and they have to be constantly writing. So, yeah, I mean, it's a real trend. So, in 2020, the Chronicle of Higher Education actually did a survey. And in that survey, more than half of the faculty members were actually considering retiring or changing careers, right? And this connection actually comes from the big issue, as I said earlier, the great higher education resignation. So many of them are looking at retirement, and in some disciplines, like we actually don't have enough PhDs to fill that pipeline and replace them. So what is higher education going to do? That's, I mean, and I do believe that that's where coaching is very critical, Tim, right? So we can help people see their transferable skills and highlight those, right? And it help them to reframe their professional identity. I'm just no longer Dr. Malik or Professor Malik. Who am I now? And how do I bring what I've done um, into the outside of the institution? And like for myself, I was a little fortunate in the sense that I actually spent time in corporate America, and then went into academia, and now out of academia. So I was able to bring that in and kind of have that as a background for myself. But a lot of academics don't have that, so that's why it's really critical that they actually work with a coach or work with someone to help them to gain that confidence, right? So sometimes we need someone to like give us an ear, listen to us, and say, no, hold on, you doing X, you actually doing, you can do Y somewhere else, right? Um,
Mhm.
so like we just want to be able to tell our story more confidently, right? So, and sometimes that story comes from outside. We come from inside to be able to tell outside that, hey, this is who I am. I'm not just an academic, that I bring more to the table. So, personally, I believe that coaching makes the skills that were invisible visible. So those skills and those strengths and those possibilities that people don't even realize that they've had. I mean, Tim, we all, right? Like, I'm sure even for yourself, right? Like, have you, did you think like, oh, I can be an entrepreneur? I know I have a PhD and I have, I've worked at bring these skills, but I'm sure that you also needed someone to say, hey, like this is how you can use what you know outside. So I think coaching is very critical when we're talking about people that are transitioning out or actually thinking about transitioning out and helping them to really be empowered. So, for those that are listening and working in higher education, like I really invite you, like what skills do you already have that are transferable? Like really look at what you have. And if not, like if you can't sort it out, get in touch with a coach that works through, like Tim, in the higher education arena where like they know what's happening and they know how to transfer those skills.
You mentioned reframing professional identity, and I just had another conversation with another guest where we talked about that same thing because especially faculty have such deep subject matter expertise, and that really defines who they are by and large, not just as academic professionals, but almost like who they are as
Yeah.
people, which is it's kind of sad sometimes when you think about it. And there's the other thing that, as far as faculty is concerned, that I've written and spoken about as well. That's what I call the faculty leadership trap. Again, faculty they who do get a PhD. Of course, not everybody has a PhD, and especially administration, non-academic administration, middle management, so forth. A lot of people don't have PhDs, but those who do go through that process, it's really all about them, right? It's about their dissertation, their research, their publications, conference presentations, their advancement, their tenure promotion, all these things. And all of a sudden, they are um, tagged or given the opportunity to move into a leadership position, but they're so completely ill prepared for it. So that's another challenge there. And again, there is a pipeline with faculty, but there's not sufficient preparation along that pipeline. So that's one of the things. Now, on the staff side, the non-academic staff side, it's a very different story. And people I have met, I have worked with, and even including myself, a lot of times there is no succession planning built in whatsoever. You are get hired into a particular position. It's your job description, your title, your
Yeah.
pay, your rank, whatever team you're in, and you can't move in and out of that unless you leave the institution altogether, work somewhere else, and then come back at work at another institution, then come back and get into a higher position potentially. So it's really annoying. And another thing that I've noticed, and I heard the story just yesterday through a client, is that if staff have an opportunity elsewhere and they want to ask for retention counteroffer, they don't get it. In fact, some handbooks say staff do not get retention offers. And that is such nonsense, really, when you think about it. So, Rubina, apart from the faculty side, what's your experience working with non-academics, with, let's say, middle managers, people who are in the on the administrative track, and how do you potentially tailor your approaches uh, to work with the staff, the non-academic staff, versus the academic faculty?
First of all, Tim, as you know, like coaching isn't like just a one size fits all, right? So I'm not how I'm going to coach you, or I'm going to have coaching someone else. So everything is going to be different. So so let's just say, so I think when you look at academics, let's talk from there. So we might look at them through who they are as their research identity or their autonomy and that tenure professor, that pressure that they have. So sometimes when I'm working with academics, there's a lot of inquiry driven, like who are you, what is it that you want? And, is this the process that you want to go through? But for the professional staff, it really is about having to navigate bureaucracy. I talked about sometimes it's political, and it's building that leadership presence, and as well as finding that clarity in your purpose and your career pathways that sometimes aren't always defined. You're in the same position for decades, and nobody's tapped you on the shoulder and say, hey, you know what, you've done X, Y, and Z. We would like to help to see how we can take you to another role. But I think with staff, like some of the things I'm just talking about, like navigating the bureaucracy, like building their leadership presence and finding clarity not only just for their career path but for themselves and their purpose. So when we're looking at research, research shows that academics often cite workload and resource challenges. That's the academic side. But when we're talking about the staff, what they talk about is limited development opportunities and feeling unheard. Feeling unheard. So sometimes what happens is, coaching really helps both groups, but really the staff, to give them like different tools to help them to really gain clarity, growth, and momentum in their career where they feel like there isn't any, because again, their complaint about feeling unheard. And I think that's a real statement inside of higher education that the staff have to deal with on a regular basis.
And I think there's some tremendous development and coaching opportunities also when you move up the chain of command, because as you know, a lot of times there is this staff climate survey. They might go out once a year if you're lucky, maybe once every 2 or 3 years, or not at
Yeah.
all, and then nothing really happens with it. So it's just, like what's happening with all the data they're collecting. And that's also very deflating and very demotivating for a lot of staff. And thank you for delineating so clearly the difference between what concerns faculty, or what makes faculty decide to leave. You said workload and resources versus staff, really this limited development and feeling unheard. On the faculty side, I can see it's tricky because resources are tied to a lot of things that they can't control, even the institution can't control. Workload is also tricky to address because it is what it is to some extent. But when you talk about limited development, limited opportunities to advance, to learn, and then feeling unheard, these are some structural issues that I believe we as coaches can assist institutions to address head on relatively clearly if they're willing to listen and willing to take those steps. So I really appreciate
Right.
you pointing these out, and also the fact about navigating bureaucracies and so forth. So it's really
Right.
important.
And Tim, like, I want to go back to an earlier point that I made. Like, we've got to get out of the old way of how academia was run, right? Like, okay, fine. I love to watch, British shows and old shows, and you've got like these academics that are sitting in their office and researching and talking. Like those times are gone,
In tweed jackets normally,
right?
right? With their
Yeah, just their
glasses.
glasses, and like
Yeah,
those
yeah.
times are gone. And like I'm just gonna reiterate again, like we've got to be able to move forward, and we've got to unlearn those outdated structures and reimagine, like how are we gonna run higher education? So because you got the youth that are I'm saying youth, the younger generation that's coming in, like they're not gonna deal with some of the stuff that I feel like we may have, right? They're not gonna deal with like, oh, I got to go through this whole hazing process to get tenure, right?
Yeah.
And then they also may see unfairness that's happening, the whole politics and the bureaucracy, as we mentioned, and so we've got to get past all of that. And we've got to start looking at today. Where are we today in the 21st century? And how do we really work with the people that we have today. And I think that's really important. We've got to unlearn what we know from the past.
And what you're alluding to is also this whole idea about flexibility and agility, and also how we structure the work agreement. I know there's a lot of talk in the literature where you're shifting from jobs to
Mm-hmm.
work to be done. And this is something I'm always advocating in my agile work as well. The job isn't that important. What is important is the work that needs to be done. And there is definitely a great opportunity to flatten the hierarchies and not have, grants and contracts officer one, officer two, officer three, and then manager one, manager. I mean, this is ridiculous the way it's been structured, but we're still clinging to those instead of saying, okay, what are the projects? What's the work that needs to be done? And then we assign people, or even give people to some extent an opportunity and the autonomy to assign themselves to certain projects that they feel passionate about. I mean, I know this is a huge ask and a huge lift, and for many institutional leaders, something they can't even imagine, but it is being practiced just like that out there in
Yeah.
industry. So why not try to find a way to adopt some of these practices and create, I say, a more work outcome purpose focused environment in our colleges and universities.
Yeah. Why not? Right.
So Rubina, I got a question for you, and I'd kind of like to shift a little bit because you have such a remarkable background and truly deep expertise in cross-cultural dynamics. I mean, we're talking across what, 8 time zones right now because you're in
Right.
Dubai, right? Even though you just shared with me before our meeting, you spent a lot of time in other countries. I mean, you've lived abroad and you focus so much on intercultural affairs, cross-cultural dynamics. You're so adept at navigating complex global environments. So how does that experience actually serve your role, you and your role as a coach when you work with your clients?
Yeah, so it really is an honor and a privilege to be able to do things like cross time zones, as we said. I just spent a couple months in Italy, and had a client there, and obviously clients in the U.S., clients in other areas. So it's definitely parts of the world, and it's definitely a privilege to be able to speak internationally, be able to go to conferences as well as utilize my skills. So obviously, in working in higher education is diverse and global. I like to. I'm going to use those words, and what I mean by that is, it's really invaluable to be able to work across cross cultural dynamics and work through cross cultural dynamics. So. Having worked through those cultural dynamics, it helps me to be a better coach to help navigate like different expectations and a lot of those, especially around hierarchy, as we know, from Hofstade's theory, a lot of the world, outside of the Western world is more of, you got that power dynamic, you got the individual versus, community and communal. So, for me, what I've gotten is how can I help higher education professionals and corporate professionals work through the cultural dynamics as they're working together, being able to adapt to new systems, build, how can I help to build the leaders? So just because, remember, like I said earlier, it's not a one size fits all. So, we have to look and see, okay, well, how can I work with this individual versus this individual? Like especially in this part of the world that I'm in right now, when we're talking about the power dynamics, like being a professor, being a PhD, like gives you such a high power dynamic. And then, there are certain benefits that you get with that, which I have my own opinions about too. Like you shouldn't be promoted due to tenure or your position or your seniority. It should be about what you bring to the table. But that's another conversation. But as a, but as someone,
That's a hot button issue. That's a very
right,
big one. Yeah.
right, and being someone coaching with cross cultural lens, it's optional. It's not an optional thing anymore. It's essential, because I may be looking at that lens in higher education and to teach them from that perspective. But even in corporate America, like I run global leadership incubators, and like these individuals, their skills that they need just to work with a team across across the pond, across the continents, they need to understand that it's not an option anymore for us to understand cross cultural intelligence anymore. It's a must. So you know, we have to, whether we're in the U.S. and whether we're in another continent, we have to make sure that we're able to come across and support individuals that feel like they need to be seen or heard or looked at and appreciated. And I think understanding the cross cultural dynamics really supports that. And that's what I really feel privileged to have that experience and to be able to do that with individuals.
Thank you so much for shedding some light on this. I mean, you have such amazing expertise there, and I think it would have been a shame not to talk about it. But also, while you were talking, I was reminded that, cross-cultural matters. We always think about, across national boundaries and national borders, across continents and so forth. But when you condense it down into those complex organizations that our institutions of higher learnings are, there are so many subcultures, so many silos. Different colleges within a large research university, for example, work very differently. You talked about individualism versus collectivism. I've noticed that different units have different expectations as far as that's concerned. You talked about power dynamics. Even in one institution, one college, the power dynamics or the power differential is kept relatively low. On others, it's truly hierarchical. So it's amazing to actually apply this intercultural lens then to address some of these kind of systemic issues also in our institutions. So thank you so much for bringing this up, Rubina. To wrap things up, if you were to give institutions and the coaches they hopefully will hire some advice concerning setting up career pathways, talent pipelines, ultimately helping them retain talent and foster and grow that talent. What advice would you give?
Um, Great question. And the advice that I would give to institutions is um, look internally. Like you have individuals that already have expressed loyalty, and make sure, as I just expressed earlier, like some people feel like they're not seen. This isn't Rubina talking. This is research, right? So really
Yeah.
start training internally, right? Like look at the leaders that you have, mentor them, coach them, really have them see a pathway for themselves that it's not just a come to work, do your job, and go home. There's nothing for you to do, but like really help them to do professional development. And that professional development is more than just, yeah, but we got LinkedIn or we have a webinar. There's more to it than that. So
Those
that's one
wonderful
thing.
one-offs, right? They're so super effective.
Right. Yeah, I'm not saying that those aren't, but coaching and live workshops, and I run incubators, and those individuals, like, they love the camaraderie. They love learning from each other and creating that community internally from their organization. So there's many ways to help develop and have your people feel like they're seen and that you're putting effort into them, which is really essential. And also, I would say, so making sure you're looking internally of those leaders that you want to develop, and do it early. Don't do it like, oh my God, we have a position open. We need to find someone. Oh yeah, that Tim dude, he seems to always be working. Well, then what's happened, and that we talked about that burnout. What happens is Tim gets Tim does everything. Tim gets burned out, but like really, how do we make sure that we don't play politics and spread stuff overall and motivate individuals? I think also that why not add professional development to the performance review and succession planning part of the performance review, right? So why not have it be performance based? Don't just look at somebody just because they're tenure. We've got to start doing better as academics, right? So are someone really shining and okay, they don't have tenure yet, but they're really doing a great job. Why not? Let's support them in a different way. And what I can say is coaching is one of those tools that higher education can look at and help ways to engage individuals in their mid-career and prepare not just the mid-career, but the next generation of leaders. So I think it's really important that we start that and we start it early.
I love that, Rubina. Thank you. Thank you so much. The irony here is what you're talking about is helping institutions of higher learning become learning organizations because they're really not by and large. So the irony is definitely not lost, I think, on any of our listeners and any of your viewers. So I think this is a wonderful spot to end this conversation. Rubina, thank you so very much for your expertise and for your insights and for your wisdom. I truly appreciate your time. And thank you all to all our visitors for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, as always, please click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support is really important to us. And also, as always, you can find more information on this episode, our guest, and today's topic at our companion website, higheredcoaching.us or leadershipimagined.com/podcast. See you again soon. And for now, keep making a difference, one client and one conversation at a time.